Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be getting into episodes 701 through 703, which will cover manga chapters 762 through 764. And we finally get into the meat of Law and Doflamingo's horrifying and tragic backstory. Alright, so synopsis. We learn the history of where both Law and Doflamingo came from and the horrors that both of them had to endure until they were both brought together. However, Law's true salvation was not found in Doflamingo, but in an unexpected place in Doflamingo's brother Corazon, as they form an unexpected bond. Alright, so differences. Thankfully, there aren't as many differences in these, and for the flashback, it stays relatively true to its source material, which is good, because I do not want anything ruining these flashbacks. So, the first one, when Law stabs Corazon in the anime, it doesn't actually show the knife sticking out of his front, like it does in the manga, and you actually only see a blood stain on his front sort of abdomen area. And obviously this was done to sort of minimize the violence, but it does kind of create a weird sort of inconsistency, kind of, where Law later on says, like, how is he not dead yet? Like, I saw the blade go through his body, where we didn't actually see that blade go through his body. So there's that kind of slight inconsistency, but I mean, I can let that slide. One really big change that was made, though, is the way in which the people of the island that Doflamingo and his family lives in learns of their celestial dragon heritage. So in the anime, they just have Homing come out and introduce himself as a former celestial dragon. But in the manga, it was actually Doflamingo's sort of entitled behavior that caused that information to be leaked, as it's the moment where Doflamingo yells at everyone for not submitting to them that causes them to realize that they're ex-celestial dragons. And I thought that this was a bad change in the sense that I like that it's sort of almost like poetic justice that Doflamingo's sort of entitled celestial dragon behavior is what caused them to be outed and suffer all of that. It wasn't his father's fault, although I can see the argument where the reason why that they did it this way was because they wanted to make it so that it was completely Homing's fault that this all happened to Doflamingo, and it kind of fuels his anger even more because of all of that. And of course, we don't see quite the whole story yet, but we do understand, like, yeah, Doflamingo is insanely pissed off at his father for what he did. And I think this is another sort of log in the fire that burns within Doflamingo. And so I can see it either way, but I do I think I prefer the sort of the poetic justice of Doflamingo's sort of entitlement is what caused him to suffer so much in that moment. The other difference is at the end of episode 703, when we get to that moment just after Law makes Corazon breakfast and all of that, instead the manga actually doesn't cut away. It actually, the chapter ends on a pretty good cliffhanger where Doflamingo actually calls them on the Dendemushi after 6 months later, and then they have to figure out, like, what are they going to say, and that's where the chapter ends. But for some reason, the episode of 703, which follows essentially that same chapter, instead of showing that last scene, it cuts away to the present to see Law fighting Doflamingo and Luffy still struggling against Bellamy and the string clone, which I guess is fine. I don't understand why they felt they need to change that, but ultimately it's not really that big of a deal because all of that stuff gets added back into the next episode, so all right, I guess. Just seems like a really weird choice. Alright, so yeah, thankfully there aren't as many differences because this set of episodes is pretty dense and there's a lot to talk about. And so let's get started. So these episodes pick up right where we left off, continuing on from Law and Doflamingo's flashback. One thing to note in terms of consistency is the hat that Law is wearing has the brim that goes all the way around, which is consistent with the version of his hat that he was wearing pre-time skip, whereas during the 2-year time skip, he changes his hat a little bit, and it's the sort of cap style brim where it's just the front, kind of showing that Law must have kept that hat since he was a kid until he became like a shichibukai and then decided to change it up. Another very interesting observation that we see is that we see Senor Pink, and he's looking pretty suave and very similar to your traditional mobster with like the slick back hair and the suit, without his gut, and most apparent of all, he's not wearing his baby outfit. However, during the flashback of what happened in Dressrosa that took place 10 years from the present, when Doflamingo took over the country, he was already in his baby outfit. So something must have happened during the 6-year time span between this flashback and the earlier flashback that caused him to radically shift his personality and style. And during this time, Law continues to try and earn a spot in the Don Quixote family, but Corazon continues to throw him out, and everyone else, including Doflamingo, won't take him seriously until they notice the white discoloration in his torso. And Jola mentions that Law has a disease called white lead disease and freaks everyone out because it's rumored to be extremely contagious. But Doflamingo, being incredibly well connected and intelligent, already knows the actual truth behind white lead disease, in that it's not a contagious disease, but it's actually poisoning of some sort, and even scolds Jola for spreading unsubstantiated rumors, which is pretty refreshing even for a villain. After learning this, Doflamingo immediately jumps into intel gathering, again showing that nothing gets by him and he will find value in things and carefully utilize it, as well as analyze anything that may have value, including more information about Flevance, where Law is actually from, and what actually happened there concerning the white lead or amber lead disease in some other translations as well. And we learn more about Law in addition to this. And I love that earlier when Doflamingo thinks Law is still just a punk kid trying to act tough, he merely states that you can bluff all you want, but once he hears the horrifying nature of how Law managed to escape Flevance as the apparent sole survivor of that town by hiding in a pile of corpse, Doflamingo's eyes perk up a bit because he realizes this kid really has seen hell, and his assertion that he no longer cares about anything is likely genuine. Doflamingo sees a truly messed up but a tough kid that has nothing to lose that he can mold into a useful subordinate. So to quickly circle back though, before we move on the translation of Law's disease. So in the subtitles and the official translation, they call it white lead disease, which is correct as haku means white. However, the kanji used in hakuenbyo is actually amber lead disease. So most people have long called it amber lead disease, which is what I've known it since this chapter debuted. And so that is what I'll be referring to as going forward. But do know that this one is actually completely up to your preference. Neither is wrong, and both are fairly accepted among the community. And so you could call it white lead disease or amber lead disease, and most people will know which ones you're talking about. But I'm going to stick with amber lead because that's how I've called it my entire time of having read this part of One Piece. So yeah. Now, on a lighter note, we see that the dynamic between Law and Baby 5 has kind of been that way since the beginning, where she kind of berates him for talking out of turn, but as soon as Law glares at her, she gets really upset and starts crying and cowering behind someone else, which we saw in both Punk Hazard and in Dressrosa, particularly in the suits room when he first was brought up there just before the whole God Usopp thing happened. The other thing that's very apparent is that because the Don Quixote family are still just in their early stages, they make an effort to seem like they're living an upper-class lifestyle by dressing nice and eating somewhat nice food, but it's being done in this like scrap dump. And yeah, despite not having much yet and being unable to live sort of the lavish life of a world noble, he still tries to keep that appearance up, which I find is very interesting and very indicative of sort of where Doflamingo's sort of mindset is. The other thing that I noticed immediately is how over the years, the more power and wealth they gain, the more lavishly they must have lived. And you can tell this especially by the physical appearances as well as the way they dress, particularly with the Don Quixote family. Like, looking at Jola, Makvice, Laoji, and the aforementioned Senor Pink, they have all gained a considerable amount of weight and gotten a little bit out of shape to the point where they are noticeably fat in the present. Laoji perhaps gets a little bit of a pass because he's just getting old, but I have no idea what everyone else's excuse is for letting themselves go that much, particularly like Makvice and Jola. My goodness, like they really let themselves go. Senor Pink obviously has somewhat of a reason for what happens to him. Like something traumatic must have happened to him to become the baby version of that instead of sort of this suave mobster, yakuza type of persona. So that there might be something more too. But I mean, who knows? Maybe Jola and Makvice have something as well. But it seems like it's more an indication of the fact that, yeah, over time, because they got sort of more lavish and their lifestyles gained more prominence, that they just kind of let themselves go. Also notably absent here is Monet, Sugar, and Virgo. So they most likely joined later. However, we do know what Virgo is actually up to. And he is already part of the Don Quixote family, but he obviously was sent in as a mole in the Marines. And we do actually see at the end of this set of episodes, we do see that Virgo gets a mention there when he requests to be transferred to G5, kind of setting up the whole operation. So what's crazy is that happened, 2 years have passed. So 14 years. It took 14 years for all of that to sort of come to fruition. Like Virgo had to basically play a Marine, and a good Marine at that, for 14 years until Doflamingo could finally get everything right. Actually, I guess that it could have been earlier, because I mean, the whole point of Virgo being transported to G5 was to get Caesar into Punk Hazard and then to steal children so that he can experiment on them. So it might have taken like a decade, maybe, because we know that that accident that took out Punk Hazard didn't happen until the time skip. So yeah, it could have been anywhere between 10 to 12 years ago, I guess so. Because then Akainu and Kuzan would have their fight on that island. And so we know that whole Caesar thing didn't happen until after that. So yeah, it is still interesting just how long Virgo had to go undercover. And then speaking of Punk Hazard, obviously Monet and Sugar not being there, we now know why Law didn't know what Sugar looked like or what her powers are. And it was revealed in an SBS that both Monet and Sugar are sisters, and they didn't join until the conclusion of this flashback. So yeah, that's pretty much why Law didn't know them. We do see Dellinger joins a little bit later on in this set of episodes as well. Now, Oda uses Baby 5 asking Gladius about Flevance and the disease as a way to exposit the story of Flevance and Law's backstory, describing it as a city that obtained vast wealth and resources due to their large deposit of what's called amber lead. And this was used to create a whole bunch of different goods and it boosted their economy due to its high quality and beauty, attracting even the world government. But we also see life in Flevance from Kid Law's perspective, as we see where his sort of surgeon of death epithet arose from, as his father was a doctor and he himself was training to be a doctor as well. And this is probably where his love and skills as a medical practitioner came from. They go on to explain that Flevance fell to ruin due to the fact that it was discovered that amber lead was actually poisonous, and prolonged exposure to it, especially the process of mining and refining it, caused people's bodies to erode and die. And the worst part of this is that the world government and the royalty of Flevance all knew about this but kept it hidden so that they could keep producing it and profit off of it. And by the time they realized that it was a problem and that generations after generations, their lifespan were shortening as people who've been exposed to the poisoning, their offspring would have shorter and shorter lifespans, to the point where Law's generation only had about a lifespan of 13 to 14 years. Due to all of that, everyone at the same time got sick in the country. And then this is where, due to rumor and misinformation that amber lead disease was contagious, Flevance was quarantined and cut off from the rest of the world, with the royals and the world government abandoning the citizens, which unfortunately an all too real outcome, even our real world, showing just how dangerous and harmful misinformation to the masses can be. Eventually, the citizens of Flevance fought back to free themselves, but this was just used as justification of all the neighboring countries to use force in the name of self-defense to essentially commit genocide against the entire country of Flevance. And this is where the flashback takes a horrifying and sad turn, where we see Law and the other children all trying to escape to safety, but Law stays behind to help his sister, Lami. And this is probably one of, if not the most heartbreaking and horrifying flashbacks in One Piece. It goes to some truly dark places as we see desperate people begging and pleading for help. Law's father trying to call for help from the outside, but no one is willing to help because the world government refuses to report the truth that it's not contagious, and it would just be easier for them to cover it up by wiping them all out. And this would allow the world government to not have to dig up the fact that they knew about the poison for nearly a century and didn't warn anyone about it. But the worst is experiencing all this from Little Law's perspective, as soldiers make it to their home and murder his father while he has to run for his life until he comes across the nun and all the other kids who were trying to escape and who were promised safe passage are gunned down. On top of that, the hospital was burned down with his sister Lami still inside, and in an instant, Law has experienced something no child should ever have to go through. And unfortunately, many children today are experiencing something very similar in the real world. And not to diminish the atrocities happening around the world by relating them to a fictional animated series, but I did want to at least mention that things like this just shouldn't happen to anyone, yet it still is. This is one situation where fiction is too close to reality, but it's also good to be reminded and to take a moment, and reflect on it and to just see what you can do to help. And another aspect to this that hits very close to reality is that the country of Flevance is actually based on real life cities and real life cases around the world, and amber-lead disease is essentially based on asbestos poisoning. Asbestos was a mineral that was very versatile in use for building materials and building insulation, as well as for like fabric. It was very popular for a while, but it was later discovered to be carcinogenic and toxic to humans because of its sort of fibrous nature. When it's broken and the dust particles get into the air, even just breathing in a small amount of the microscopic crystals can lead to many health problems, including a form of cancer. However, like Flevance and the world government, many of the towns would mine them without knowing its toxic nature and profit greatly from them. But even when it was discovered in the early 1900s that it was toxic, many governments around the world didn't act quickly enough. And in the US, it was discovered that many of the asbestos companies knew about its harmful effects, yet kept it secret. And it would slowly be phased out of use, thankfully, and eventually outright banned in 2003, which is insane because that almost is the exact timeline. About a century it took to rectify this problem. And yeah, it's insane how, this situation basically happened. I mean, the genocide wasn't that much part of it. No, I don't think any, at least in my research, no city was wiped out because of asbestos mining. But yeah, I mean, we still do see that for other reasons, unfortunately, but not due to asbestos. But yeah, when you combine those two atrocities together, it's definitely a pretty sobering experience, especially doing a lot of the research for this part. Was pretty heartbreaking. Moving on, though, one thing to note is that the Don Quixote family, and Baby Five in particular, actually shows a good amount of empathy and compassion as she hears the atrocities committed on Law and his town of Flevance, showing that while she's still young, she hasn't been completely corrupted by Doflamingo and the family yet. And even in the modern day, she's shown that she is still probably the most sensible out of the Don Quixote family, and still has somewhat of a good heart. And she's mostly just following the Don Quixote family because she has this deep-seated need to be needed by other people. And so this is the one place that will give that to her. But it doesn't really seem like she's just inherently evil in any way like some of the other members. Now that we have Law's past, we move on to Doflamingo, and his story is just as harrowing and intense. It seems that Doflamingo's father, Don Quixote Homing, decided that he wanted to live as a normal human, and as he puts it, quote, "It's more satisfying to live as a human," despite all of the other celestial dragons telling him that he's nuts to give that power up. And, well, they're all kind of right, despite Homing's heart being in the right place. This decision was, I don't know how you could say it any other way. It was incredibly stupid and naive on Homing's part, especially since Doflamingo, even at a young age, is already too far gone in sort of the indoctrination of the celestial dragon lifestyle. He clearly feels entitled to the power and respect that comes with it. And the first thing he's looking to do after he's left that life is still to acquire slaves. Like, geez, how messed up is that? Like, Corazon, or Rocinante, as we learned is his real name, seems much more on the quieter side. And I sometimes wonder if there was more to Homing's decision to leave Marie-Joie. But from the information we're given, it really does seem like it was a well-intentioned but horribly ill-informed decision. I know some people in the fandom have tried to sort of attribute this to maybe that there might be an ulterior motive, like maybe they were on the verge of being kicked out because of Doflamingo. But I think this was simply a case of Homing just being incredibly naive. When they go into town, it's revealed to everyone in the island that they're former celestial dragons. And if we go by the manga canon, it's poetic, like I said, that Doflamingo's entitled behavior as he threatens them as if he still has that power as a world noble, that he gets them really noticed and results in everyone storming their mansion and burning it to the ground, forcing the family to flee to the slums. And I gotta be honest, I don't blame them. I don't feel an ounce of sympathy for the Don Quixote family. And I mean, after we've seen what the Celestial Dragons have done, I really cannot blame the townspeople for doing what they did. I mean, obviously, it's never good to murder or torture anyone, but if there was ever a case, this would probably be the closest you could ever get to saying, yeah, I get that. Like, Homing, his wife, and Rocinante actually do seem like nice people, Doflamingo aside. But the Celestial Dragons as a whole, like I've said many times, are literally the worst villains I've ever seen in any fictional story. And Doflamingo, even at that age, is such a little prick. Like, you just know he's going to grow up to be a terrible human being. We then get a montage of things getting worse for the Don Quixote family as Doflamingo and Rocinante get beaten as they scrounge for food, with a really random Panda Man sighting, both in the anime and the manga. Although it's a lot more subtle in the manga, while in the anime it's really jarring. I mean, during the moment where two children are being beaten and a shirtless Panda Man is just standing there prominently, like, smiling down watching this, is really weird. Eventually, it leads to Doflamingo's mom passing away from an illness. And after this, we eventually catch up with the harrowing scene at the beginning of the episode 702. And it's at this point something snaps in Doflamingo, creating basically the monster we know today. Flashing back ahead, where Law is brought before Doflamingo and the family, with Corazon still, to Law's surprise, alive. But even more shocking is that he didn't rat him out, and Doflamingo officially invites him to join the family, and not just to be another member, but to be personally groomed to become Doflamingo's right-hand man in 10 years, saying that despite his life expectancy only being about 3 years, that there are devil fruits that could potentially heal him, and that they're going to try and look for them. Probably referring to the Ope Ope fruit at this point, but there might be a few others, and I might talk about other potential candidates that this could have been in the spoiler section. But one other note about this scene, though, is I love that all Law had to do to buy Buffalo's silence for stabbing Corazon was to buy him ice cream, which seems really minimal for almost committing murder. It's pretty crazy. That's just how nuts this family is. Now, this brings up a strange question of why Corazon protected Law despite him seemingly hating kids. And we do eventually find out why. And it's here that you begin to wonder if Corazon actually hates kids at all. Like, what if he secretly actually likes kids and doesn't want these kids to get involved with Doflamingo? And him treating these kids so badly is because he's using that as a cover to get these kids to give up and run away. And eventually we do learn that that is, in fact, what is actually happening. And yeah, I don't know. I think for me, this was pretty obvious at the time when I read this chapter, because it just, I don't know, it just seemed really weird how much he'd go out of his way to treat these kids so poorly. And yet he didn't turn Law in, which was very weird. Then we get, and it's weird to say this about a crime/pirate family, that we so despise in the present day, but a fairly wholesome montage of Law and the Don Quixote family growing together over a 2-year time span, as we see Law get trained both physically and academically, which adds up to why he's so strong yet also incredibly intelligent as a doctor. Just Doflamingo had mentioned a couple episodes ago that Law was trained in marksmanship by Gladius, swordsmanship by Diamante, and martial arts by Lao Ji, and we see that happening in real time. But the real bombshell reveal of this episode is when Baby Five and Buffalo ask Law what his real name is. Baby Five and Buffalo are, obviously code names, and they tell Law that what their real names are, but we don't get to hear them, unfortunately. But Law, on the other hand, we do hear, as there's more to his name that we never knew about, because he is a D. His full name is Trafalgar D. Water Law, and Corazon overhears this and immediately grabs Law and drags him into an alley and speaks. And it's so shocking that Law's first reaction is to assume that someone else is there who is speaking and not Corazon himself. I thought that was pretty funny. And it turns out that Corazon could always talk. He just never spoke and let people assume he was mute. But Corazon very vehemently says that if Law is truly a D, that he needs to get away from Doflamingo as soon as possible. And it's here we start to get a sense of the relationship that Law and Corazon would have that would lead Law to cherish him so much in the present day. As if that wasn't enough of a surprise, Corazon also reveals that he's got a devil fruit power. And although it's not a really crazy one, and it's not very offensive minded, but very appropriate given his cover as a mute person. He has what's called the Nagi Nagi no Mi, or the Calm Calm fruit, that allows the user to create soundproof environments. And translators note, Nagi means calm in Japanese. So Law's natural reaction to all of this is that everything he knows about Corazon is a lie, but then he asks, is his clumsiness even also part of that lie? And was that all an act too? And you as the reader/viewer would, your initial thought is to believe that, yes, that in fact was an act to disarm everyone around him. But that part is actually true. And he still is a giant klutz despite how cool he tries to appear when lying about the fact that no, that was all an act, as he sets himself on fire yet again. And I crack up every time I see this scene. It's just how serious and cool Corazon tries to play it off while also setting himself on fire. It's a great classic Oda joke. But yeah, now that we get to hear Corazon's voice, we can kind of talk about his voice actor. So Corazon/Rocinante is played by a very familiar voice actor, if you're an anime fan, as he is voiced by Koichi Yamadera, who is probably most famous for voicing Spike Spiegel in Cowboy Bebop. His other more notable roles is Ryoji Kaji in Evangelion, and more recently as the God of Destruction Beerus in Dragon Ball Super, as well as some of all the accompanying material, like the movies and video games and stuff like that. But he's also a gentle criminal in My Hero Academia as well. That's a much more minor role, but I do like that character. Needless to say, they got an incredibly cool voice for Corazon. Now, Rocinante, unlike his brother, turns out did take more after his kind-hearted parents and is only hanging around Doflamingo to keep him in check. But to hear him so bluntly say, I don't know how such a monster could have been born from my kind-hearted father and mother, and that Doflamingo has no humanity in him, tells you all you need to know, just how messed up Doflamingo really is if his own brother is saying all of this. We then get to see a continuation of the hanging scene as we see the current day Don Quixote Doflamingo essentially being born. Despite being strung up to be executed, he boldly proclaims that he will not die and that he will come back and kill every last one of them. And honestly, there's a little part of me that respects that level of confidence, even if it is fueled by pure hatred. Despite being in a no-win situation, Doflamingo found a way to somehow survive and roared back with a vengeance. And that is just a terrifying thought. And in this conversation, we also get our first new bit of information concerning the Will of D. And it's been a while, I feel like, that since we've gotten any new piece of information about the Will of D, as it's explained to us that the D are something that all celestial dragons are taught about, kind of like a cautionary fairy tale to children, saying that if they act up, they will be eaten by a D. And among the celestial dragons, the D-clan are known as the sworn enemies of the gods, meaning if in this case that God is referring to the celestial dragons, then their sworn enemy is the D-clan. And this is very interesting because this piece of lore led to the idea that D could in fact stand for devil. If we were to look at the most common sworn enemy of God, it would be the devil. And also devil fruits are what often give these people power to oppose the celestial dragons. And I even thought this myself after reading this chapter, but I still somehow doubt that it would be that simple and straightforward for Oda. Like, I just don't see Oda going down this route where D just means devil. It just seems too easy and straightforward. So I still hold I reserve my sort of predictions on this one. One other thing I wanted to mention when it came to the translation here, as there is a bit of nuance that changes the connotation a tiny bit, and that's concerning the word tenteki. So in the translation, it translates tenteki as sworn enemy, but if you translate it directly, tenteki is more like a natural enemy. It's not just that both sides are vehemently opposed, but there is something inherent in their makeup that naturally makes them enemies. Think of like fire versus water. These two elements would be considered a tenteki because of just how inherent their opposition is to each other, which leads me to believe that there's more to their opposition than just that they don't like each other. There's something like a bit of a fated rivalry with each other almost. It's such an interesting word to use here because you want to know the other really interesting parallel when it comes to this word is? The last time this term was used was by Nami during Skypiea, where everyone first realizes that Luffy is immune to Enel's lightning because he's rubber. And she refers to Luffy as Enel's tenteki or natural enemy. And this is interesting because Enel, who is someone that claims to be God, has a natural enemy in Luffy who ultimately defeats him. And what's crazier is that the more we learn about the series, Skypiea is almost like a microcosm of the One Piece world as a whole, and it serves as a foreshadow for so much that we eventually go on to see, and it is crazy. And I just think that it sort of like sets up the fact that, yeah, Luffy himself is a tenteki or a natural enemy to the Celestial Dragons, much like many of the other D-Clan members as well. So it's just something really interesting that Oda chose to use this word again here to describe the D-Clan versus the Celestial Dragons. And I think that's kind of lost when you change the word up to sworn enemy instead of natural enemy, because I do think while the idea is still there, but I do think that the nuance there is important to make the distinction. It's not just a sworn enemy, it's a natural one, that they are just naturally don't mix, and they are the opposites, like the natural opposites of each other. And so I think it was important to kind of point that out. Now, hearing all this nonsense about the D-Clan, it doesn't mean much to Law, and naturally his reaction to all these things is, I have no idea what you're talking about, but he understands that Corazon is lying to Doflamingo and threatens to out him. But at the last second, Law decides against it to even the sort of the debt that he has when Corazon didn't rat him out for stabbing him 2 years prior. And immediately after this, they have to set sail due to their location being tracked by the Marines, but not just any Marine, it's the legendary Vice Admiral Tsuru. And one thing that I always found very interesting about this is how scared they are of Tsuru, even Doflamingo himself. We know that she is part of that legendary Marine trio with Sengoku and Garp, but we rarely get to see her in action, and we've only seen a glimpse of her wash powers and her in combat once during Marineford. And seeing this moment was, has always made me want to see Tsuru in action in the present, or even in her prime. Like, we've gotten to see Garp and Sengoku and their strength, but for some reason Oda is reluctant to show us Tsuru. And this just makes me want to see what makes even Doflamingo run and hide with his tail behind his leg or between his legs. Like, she must be fierce if Doflamingo is scared of her, because we clearly see Doflamingo has his Ito powers and he's already pretty strong by this point. And so, yeah, to see how, I don't know, why Doflamingo is so scared of Tsuru is pretty incredible, and it really makes you want to see what she can do. We also see that they've now recruited a young Dellinger toddler, and he's so young. Like, no wonder Dellinger's probably the most psychotic of all the Don Quixote members, because he was essentially raised by them in his most formative developmental years, which, yeah, he is psycho. And yeah, during all this chaos, though, running from Tsuru, Corazon just straight up kidnaps Law to seek out treatment for him, to see if they can find a doctor that can cure him of the Amberlet disease. And when we catch back up with them, we learn something with a bit of a twist that I didn't see coming at all. Corazon is actually a Marine spy working undercover directly for then Admiral Sengoku. And I find it hilarious that their call sort of recognition code is rice crackers. And yeah, this new development really flips everything kind of on its head. Because not only is Rocinante not an evil pirate, but he's actually a good Marine trying to keep Doflamingo under control. It's not just out of his own sort of self-preservation and desire to rein Doflamingo in. Like, it's his actual mission now. And addition to that, it's to try and keep kids away from this lifestyle, like we mentioned earlier. And I remember it's at this point it really made me wonder what led these two to connecting and working together. But Rocinante clearly took after his parents in terms of their good-heartedness, and Doflamingo took more after the Celestial Dragons as a whole. But that was then dialed up to 12 when he was tortured by those villagers. And Rocinante may have actually sought out the Marines, seeing just how dangerous Doflamingo is after they survived that torture. But from there, we get a pretty funny yet incredibly sad montage of Corazon and Law visiting one hospital after another. But not only are they refused care, Law is continuously subjected to dehumanizing treatment, as all they see, and by they I mean the doctors, is a walking biohazard and not a child that's sick and scared and needs help. And due to the propaganda that the world government has been spreading about the disease, everyone freaks out at any mention of Law's disease, which angers Corazon to no end. And you can see this is really hurting Corazon too, seeing just how hurt Law is by, 6 months of trying and failing. 6 months is a long time to do something like this. And at this point, he even begins to question why he's even doing what he's doing. And one interesting thing he mentions in passing is that he mutters to himself, am I doing this for D? Almost like because the D clan members are the natural enemies of the Celestial Dragons, that maybe he has hope that by saving Law, he will one day grow up to be the person that will stop his evil brother, or perhaps even the Celestial Dragon system altogether, which is a really interesting thought. But at this point, he mentions that doesn't even matter. And even for us, I don't think that really matters, because this scene always breaks my heart, yet at the same time fills my heart. Corazon probably has one of the biggest hearts in the entire series, and it's very fitting that his codename is Heart. The scene where he breaks down by Law's side as he's sleeping and tells him just how sorry he feels for Law and the pain that he's going through. That moment he mentions how even being stabbed by Law didn't hurt at all, because all he could feel was the pain of knowing just how much suffering Law had to have been going through to make him do something like that to begin with. And that is an insane level of compassion that Corazon has. Like, if Doflamingo's evil level is a 12 out of 10, then Rocinante's kindness is equaled by being a 12 out of 10. And it's, yeah, like he says, it's incredible how these two turned out so differently. But that's not all, though. Law is awake during this and heard all of it, and it deeply touches him, and he finally has someone that genuinely cares for him as a person since, ever since his family died 2.5 years ago. And this is one of my favorite moments in the series and has always stuck with me. Just the pure love that Corazon shows for Law here can make anyone ugly cry. And their relationship from this point on is so sweet and stronger than ever. And the reaction from Corazon of Law calling him Corazon for the first time was so sweet, just how shocked he was and how Law made him breakfast and everything. And I think he was just like flabbergasted, yet also incredibly touched. But unfortunately, we'll have to wait till the next podcast to really get into the best parts of this flashback and their relationship, and why it's so memorable. But we did get a glimpse of the emotional core here and the beginning of it in the last few minutes of episode 703. But yeah, definitely get your tissues ready for the next couple episodes, because oh my god. But this is one of the best flashbacks, and I'm sure you can start seeing why. But we'll leave that there, and if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment, and if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram at SunnyGo Podcast for updates on when I post new episodes, or to see pictures of my manga collection and card collection. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to the podcast. Just a small spoiler section, I wanted to mention a couple things. But if you're not interested in that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye! All right, spoiler sections. Just two brief things I wanted to talk about. I guess the big thing I wanted to talk about is just the Don Quixote family in general. Because when you look at the two instances of the Don Quixote family, you have both Don Quixote Homing and Don Quixote Miosgard. They're both from the Don Quixote family. And I just find it interesting how both of them, while Miosgard was your sort of traditional kind of just scum of the earth celestial dragon to begin with, but by having Otohime, Queen Otohime, help him, he ultimately becomes a really good guy. Like he realizes his mistakes and is reformed by it. And honestly, I don't know that you could say that about many of the other celestial dragons. Like I don't, even if you put like Charlos in that position, I don't think he would be reformed. But Miosgard took that lesson and his experiences and actually got better from it. And Homing, on the other hand, he seemingly already was a good guy. So it's really interesting how the Don Quixote family, at least the several instances we know of them, they seem like the least worst celestial dragon family so far. But they also produced one of the most like horrific ones in Doflamingo, who is just absolutely horrifying and cruel and evil. But yeah, I always found that very, very interesting how the probably the most like, I don't know, the kind-hearted celestial dragon family birthed one of the most cruel and terrifying amongst them all. It's just really interesting how that happened. Now, the other thing I wanted to kind of talk about in the spoiler section is the alternative fruits that could have potentially saved Law. So obviously, Doflamingo was referring to the Ope Ope fruit, most likely. But I wonder if we haven't seen it yet, but I wonder if Manshuri's Chiu Chiu fruit could have healed him. The other one that I always thought about is, could Magellan's Doku Doku fruit also at least made him immune to it? Because it's technically called amber-lead poisoning. So it's like maybe Magellan's like poison fruit would allow him to become immune to poison. The other one, this isn't really a devil fruit, but I do wonder if like maybe Reiju could have like sucked out the poison from Law. This is obviously, it's not a devil fruit power, but it's specific to Reiju. But I wonder if Law had met Reiju at some point, she could have removed the poison. The other fruit that could have potentially helped him would be Marco's Tori Tori no Mi, the model Phoenix, the mythical zone fruit. That seems like it could heal anything too. And so yeah, and obviously at that point in time, I think Marco already had that fruit, so it'd probably be hard to take from him from that. But yeah, I feel like there are a couple other fruits that could have helped Law at this point, but definitely Ope Ope fruit was the goal. Anyways, let me know if you can think of any others that could have potentially helped Law. But yeah, thanks for listening, and I will hope to see you on the next episode. See ya!